Hi everyone, welcome to part 3. Okay, Ponomariov has just played king h7. So then Kramnik played rook a6, and came h4 check and king h2, which was another small inaccuracy. The position is now dead equal, but it was king f2, where white still has a small advantage after, with best play, rook d7, knight takes c3, b takes c3, rook takes c3, rook d2 check, king e1, rook takes g2, rook takes a5, and f5. White is still slightly better, although it's going to be hard to win this game. It's probably a table-based win, although they don't have table bases for these many pieces yet. But I think with perfect play, white would be able to win this. But anyway, we go back to the game. After h4, and also it's interesting, or it's important to note that king takes h4 is a blunder due to bishop d3 attacking the rook, which can't take on a5 because of bishop f6 check, winning the rook at c1. So it would have to be rook d6, but now comes bishop f6 check anyway, and black is much better after rook takes f6, rook takes c1, and rook takes f7. Once again, these pawns are going to be decisive. So anyway, back to the game. After h4 was king h2. Then came rook d7, which is breaking this pin between the rooks, but it allows the knight to come back into the game with tempo. Knight c5. Then came rook e7 and rook takes h5. So one of the pawns is gone, but black still has good compensation for being the exchange down. The position is still objectively equal. Play continued, now in a time scramble with bishop d2, rook c4, and f5, which is a minor blunder that gives the advantage back to white. Better was b3, where after knight takes b3, bishop takes a5, knight takes a5, and rook e6. Black has good compensation for the pawn, and it's again equal. Excuse me. So f5, and now knight takes e4, f takes e4, rook h5 check, king g6, rook g5 check, king f6, and here the players have reached time control, and black has little if any compensation for being the exchange down now. White is definitely better. And after rook c6 check, suddenly the white rooks are seeing a lot of activity, and Kramnik, as always, is playing very accurately. So king f7, now rook f5 check, king g8, and g4, because it makes sense now for white to advance his kingside pawn majority and try and get a passed pawn of his own. So then came rook e8, rook e5, and rook b8. And it makes sense to get the rook behind the pawn, but better was rook takes e5, where after f takes e5, bishop takes e3, and king g2, white's advantage is still present, but it's fairly small, and it's going to be difficult for him to win, but with perfect play it probably would be a win. So rook b8, now g5 ensures that the pawn on h4 here remains stranded and is thus a target, because there's no g5 if this pawn was ever to move, and this h4 pawn will be a key piece in the later endgame after more simplification, you'll see as we get there. So now came king h7 from Ponomariov and rook e7, and not rook takes e4, because now comes b3 and white will have to sack a rook for the b pawn. Best play continues, rook e6, b2, rook b6, b1 queen, rook takes b1, rook takes b1, and black is of course much better. So rook e7, now bishop takes e3, and rook h6 check can be played because this pawn is pinned. Rook takes e4 was now okay, but Kramnik missed it. Let's have a look. If rook takes e4, now b3, there's rook takes e3. After b2, rook e1, b1 queen, rook takes b1, rook takes b1, and white should win, but it'll be neither short nor simple. So rook h6 check, king g8, and rook g6. Again, not rook takes h4, or the b pawn decides the game. b3, rook takes e4, b2, rook takes e3, b1 queen, and black's winning easily. So rook g6 and bishop d4. If instead bishop takes f4 check after the king moves, white can crash through with his rooks on g7, and although this isn't mating, it creates a lot of problems which Ponomariov elected to avoid and not take on f4. So now came rook g e6, king h7, f5, bishop c5, and rook e8, which is an extremely rare inaccuracy from Kramnik in the endgame, which he is known to be a master of. Better here was rook d7, and white has a significant advantage after, for example, king g8, rook takes e4, and rook f8. It'll be a matter of wearing black down to resignation, which is what Kramnik did anyway, but this would probably have been quicker. The advantage now is nearing on 2 pawns, so it would be a quicker win. So rook e8, now comes rook takes e8, rook takes e8, and now began a long and grinding 30 move endgame. Starting with b3, king g2, Kramnik gets his king involved. Now bishop e3, allowing rook takes e4, because now comes bishop takes g5. Now rook b4, and the b pawn is falling. And Kramnik gives a very instructive example of how to win the endgame and exchange down. The play of both players was very accurate, but there's nothing Ponomariov can do except try to put up as much resistance as possible and hope for a draw by threefold repetition or a break of the 50 move rule. But as I said, Kramnik is an endgame expert, and he proved it with this display of his technique. After g6 came rook b7 check. He's in no rush to take this b pawn. There's no way for black to defend it anyway, and it's better for him to activate his king, which he does in a moment. After king h6, f takes g6, king takes g6, king f3, bishop d2, king g4, and Kramnik gains the opposition, which is an important concept, as we've seen in previous videos. So now came bishop e1, rook takes b3. The pawn finally drops off, but Kramnik is presented with a problem. The bishop can defend the pawn on h4, and even if he sacks the exchange to get rid of it, it's going to be impossible for him to queen his h-pawn, as the black king can stop him from making any progress. So he must coordinate his king and rook effectively, and this is what he does. From this position, it's a win for white no matter what black plays in 41 moves with perfect play, and it's remarkable that Kramnik managed to achieve it in 21 moves. Indeed, it's a credit to his already mentioned endgame skill. Play continued with bishop g3, rook f3, bishop e1, rook e3, bishop f2, rook e6 check, king f7, attacking the rook, so king f5 defends it, and again takes the opposition and gains more ground against the black king. Bishop g3, rook e4, bishop f2, and king g5, threatening rook f4 check, winning the bishop. So bishop g3, rook e2, king g7, rook e7 check, king f8, and king f6, once again taking the opposition. And notice how his king is making significant progress up the board, which is a very important element in endgame play. In 10 moves, he's managed to get his king from being on f3 and challenged by the black king on f5, 3 ranks up the board to f6. So then came bishop f2, rook e6, bishop g3, and king g6. Okay, that's the end of part 3.